Welcome everyone, benvenuti, bentornati, and welcome back to Magazzino Italian Art. My name is Vittorio Calabrese, I'm the Executive Director here at Magazzino. For some of you that came here for the first time, Magazzino is a museum and research center dedicated to post-war and contemporary Italian art. We are at our 6th year of operation. We opened in late June of 2017. And what you saw in the parking lot is our new building about to be opened, the Robert Holding Pavilion. So keep coming. By September, we'll have more exhibition spaces, a cafe, and a bookstore, and more programming all year round. So be patient with us. We'll definitely invite you for espresso and not just black coffee, as you saw in the parking lot, in the lobby there. Magazzino is a 501c3. We are a nonprofit, and we do rely on your generosity, and I want to thank all of you for your contribution to the program. I see some of our amici di Magazzino, our patrons of Magazzino, and if you were more interested in learning more about it, at our front desk you can actually meet one of my colleague, Bernie, and they will tell you more about what that entails. We do offer free admission as well as curated activities throughout the year, special access to artists, programs, collections, and it's a way to really be part of our community and help us grow, as we've been doing that exponentially as you've been here a few times in the last 6 years. We're especially excited today because beyond exhibiting, of course, Italian art, our biggest commitment is really on research and education. The lecture series that you are part of today is actually at the 5th year. And this is Magazzino launch a fellowship, the Scholar-in-Residence program, right at the beginning of our activities, where we invite a young, recent PhD graduate to join our programs for an entire academic year. From late July, early August, through the following summer, we do host a scholar that works with us on educational programs. We do support their research, as well as working with us on curatorial projects, tours, docent training, and so on. And today I'm especially excited because you will hear from Roberta Minnucci, that is our this year's Scholar-in-Residence. Roberta curated the lecture series, and she will tell you more about in terms of the topic, but I want to thank you, Roberta, for putting this all together and coordinate so many incredible speakers. For some of you that missed the first one and the previous ones, and you'll miss maybe the next ones also, you can go on our website. There's a Mediateca page where you can actually rewatch a lot of the lecture series. But I want to introduce Roberta formally to all of you and leave you the stage to talk about the classic in Arte Povera. And Dr. Roberta Minnucci is an art historian and curator specializing in post-war Italian art. She obtained her PhD from the University of Nottingham with a thesis which examined Arte Povera's engagement with cultural memory. Prior to joining Magazzino Italian Art as our current scholar-in-residence, Roberta was a Rome Award holder at the British School of Rome and the recipient of the first edition of the Researching and Rewriting Contemporary Art History Scholarship promoted by Fondazione Baruchello. Her research has been supported by the Getty Foundation, the Association of Art History, the Association for the Study of Modern Italy, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Her articles and essays have been published in peer-reviewed academic journals and exhibition catalogs. She has gained curatorial and research experience at different institutions, including Tate Modern, Historic Collection of Modern Italian Art, Christie's, Southampton City Art Gallery, Castello di Rivoli, and Fondazione Pino Pascali. Welcome, Roberta. I'll leave you the stage for this beautiful program. Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio, for your kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this second event of this year's lecture series entitled Arte Povera, Artistic Tradition and Transatlantic Dialogue. First of all, I would like to thank the whole team here at Magazzino for their help and support in helping me to bring the research program to life. This year's lecture series interrogates Arte Povera's artistic identity in close conversation with the works on display here at Magazzino. The 4 lectures explore how, during the 1960s and 1970s, artists associated with Arte Povera reconsidered and redefined their practices by taking into account, on the one hand, the legacy of artistic tradition, and on the other hand, the dialogue with American art. The Italian artist's relationship with the United States was crucial within the artistic context of the time. References to Italian and European cultural heritage in Arte Povera appear to be employed to reclaim a specific artistic identity in the face of the increasing global relevance of American contemporary art. While Italy became a testing ground for experimental practices, attracting international artists, the Italian ones traveled to and exhibited in the United States, where they found an important platform for presenting their works to a new audience. This led to an unprecedented artistic exchange between the two sides of the Atlantic, leading Italian and American artists to engage in a sustained dialogue that is still awaiting to be fully examined in the scholarly domain. By considering the Italian artists' relationship with their own cultural heritage as well with the international artistic scene, the 4 lectures explore the complex dynamics embedded in the progressive definition of an artistic identity for Arte Povera. I hope that you will join us for the next lecture presented by Dr. Laura Pettican, who will explore Arte Povera's relationship with the Baroque, intended as a historical and conceptual category, and for the final one delivered by Dr. Raffaele Bedarida, who will examine the promotion and reception of Arte Povera in the US in relation to the 1968 exhibition Young Italians. Today, it's my pleasure to discuss my research on the reinterpretation of the past in Arte Povera with the lecture entitled Casting the Past, Arte Povera and Classical Sculpture. Michelangelo Pistoletto created the first version of the Venus of the Rugs in 1967, in the same year that the term Arte Povera first appeared on the occasion of the exhibition Arte Povera in Spazio, curated by a young Germano Celant at Galleria La Bertesca in Genoa. The work eventually became, and still is, one of the most popular related to Arte Povera, one of the first that comes to mind when we mention this group of Italian artists. An association which is likely due to the widespread, although arguable, interpretation of Arte Povera, which literally means poor art, as an art engaged with poor material, represented in this case by the rags. If we place our attention on the sculpture of Venus, however, the work can tell a different story, which is complementary to and intertwined with the most known reading of Arte Povera. The conventional interpretation of Arte Povera is based on its experimental approach to natural elements and processes, the everyday and the performative. It emphasizes the artist's interest in three-dimensional works, interacting with the surrounding environment and with the viewer, exploring sculpture in abstract terms and through unconventional materials. Although it is undeniable that this is an appropriate description for most of the artistic practices within the group, if we abide by this definition, how can we explain then the presence of sculptures that seem to have been appropriated from an art history handbook? And why some artists in particular, namely Michelangelo Pistoletto, Giulio Paolini, and Yannis Kounellis, considered classical sculpture as a relevant source for artistic expression in the 1960s and 1970s? Why did they look at the past and resort to figuration in a period when both were demonized? I will try to answer these questions in the course of this lecture by looking closely at some works in particular, in order to allow them to disclose their own stories and genealogies. The Venus of the Rags is the perfect starting point for this inquiry, as it sheds light on the progressive definition of Arte Povera's narrative in relation to the appropriation of the past, as well as on the practices employed in this reinterpretation of a specific cultural legacy. As I have mentioned, the work, created in 1967, progressively became closely associated with Arte Povera. However, it would appear that it was first exhibited in Arte Povera group shows curated by Chaland only in the 1980s, first in the exhibition Identité Italienne at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 1981, and later in a number of exhibitions organized between 1984 and 1985 in Turin, Madrid, and New York, where the work was displayed in the Knot, Arte Povera at PS1. Despite the fact that this Italian artist had exhibited in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s, both in solo and group shows, the exhibition at MoMA PS1 was the first in this country to specifically refer to Arte Povera, offering the American public an overview of the practices of this group of Italian artists. With this series of exhibitions, Chaland presented Arte Povera as an avant-garde that was aligned with the international post-minimalist practices that had emerged in the 1960s, while also being the embodiment of the Italian identity in contemporary art. The connection with the past, overlooked in the early years of Arte Povera, both in group shows and in critical text, was thus retrospectively acknowledged. The emphasis on artistic tradition was consistent with the context of the 1980s, which saw a general return to painting and to more conventional practices, as well as the emergence of a new group of Italian artists promoted by art critic Achille Bonito-Oliva, known as Transavanguardia, firmly rooted in the nation's cultural legacy. While the Venus of the Rags was progressively appropriated within Arte Povera's narrative, the use of sculptural replicas belonging to the history of Western art still appeared to clash with the experimental practices that emerged in the 1960s and 70s, which tended towards a dematerialization of the art object and the rejection of figuration in favor of abstraction. As I will demonstrate, however, also the appropriation of tradition was characterized by a highly experimental approach. Pistoletto's statue is a replica of the Venus with the Apple, a neoclassical reinterpretation of a Roman copy of a Greek original sculpture of the goddess, named Aphrodite in Greek mythology. It was realized between 1813 and 1816 by Danish artist Bertel Thorvaldsen, who had moved to Rome to study classical antiquity. The artist was inspired by the Colonna Venus in the Vatican Museums in Rome, a copy of one of the most celebrated sculptures of antiquity, the Aphrodite of Cnidus. Created by Greek artist Praxiteles in the 4th century BCE, the statue achieved a legendary status in the world for being the first naked representation of a divinity in three-dimensional and monumental form. The Greek original sculpture has not survived to the present days, as it was destroyed in fire in the 5th century CE. As a consequence, its appearance can be guessed at only through the countless reproductions produced over the centuries. Copies that, despite being inspired by the same work, all differ from one another in the freedom that each artist has taken in the reinterpretation of the original. This proliferation of replicas demonstrates that the canonical opposition between original and copy, which is still one of the founding principles of the authenticity of the work of art, is less rigid than one might think and should be reconsidered. Relevant scholarship and an exhibition at Fondazione Prada in Milan have challenged the myth of the original in classical sculpture, more specifically in relation to Roman copies of Greek originals, showing that even in antiquity, the reproduction of multiples was a common practice. This show, serial classic, curated by Salvatore Settis and Anna Anguissola, revealed the repetitive and serial nature of classical art by focusing on copies of an absent original. Over the centuries, classical sculptures have not only been reproduced as replicas, but also regarded as an important source of inspiration for artists working in different historical periods. The Renaissance and Neoclassicism in particular have provided a new reading of the classical ideal, and the Venus implied by Pistoletto appears at the end of this genealogy, from a lost Greek original to a large number of Roman copies from the neoclassical period to 1960s Italy. The artist bought the sculpture in a garden center where low-grade reproductions of famous works are offered for sale. The material reveals this provenance, given that the statue is made of concrete, a commonly used material employed in the construction industry. During the following years, Pistoletto will create other versions of Venus in different materials, including plaster and marble. The choice of the subject was motivated by the association of Venus with beauty. As the artist declared, I quote, "For Italians, Venus is the Marilyn Monroe of antiquity. She represents a static idea of beauty, a universal beauty that, of course, does not exist. She is a specific Roman goddess associated with erotic desire. In Italy, you see thousands of statues of Venus, and they're all depicted slightly differently because of the custom of a particular region. So, in a way, Venus is every woman, not a specific woman. We are not dealing anymore with an ideal beauty, but with a multiplicity," end of quote. In this statement, while the artist presents Venus as an iconic representation of beauty, he also questions the same ideal. The comparison of the Roman goddess of beauty with Marilyn Monroe is particularly revealing. The American actress was the contemporary embodiment of the new ideal of feminine beauty and had become an icon whose popular public image was disseminated through magazines and Hollywood films. Andy Warhol quickly understood that even celebrities were being swallowed by the dynamics of the consumer society, becoming objects of consumption. The series of works based on the photographic portraits of the actress that he began in the 1960s contributed to consolidate her fame not only in popular culture, but also in the artistic domain, making a Warhol's Marilyn one of the most iconic works in contemporary art, the counterpart of the Venus of the Rugs in Arte Povera. When Pistoletto compares Venus to Marilyn, he's certainly aware of the mythology surrounding the American actress figure. His analogy reclaims the image of the Roman goddess as the personification of beauty, but at the same time challenges a monolithic and standardized aesthetic ideal, finding in the many sculptural reinterpretation of Venus throughout Italy a more faithful notion of beauty, one engaged with diversity and with the unique features that every statue, as well as every person, has. The invitation to find aesthetic appreciation in multiplicity is also applied to the rugs that Pistoletto employed, as he declared, not because they are poor, but because they are beautiful. While the Venus represents the past, the rugs are rooted in the present. They are of different colors, arranged in a chaotic manner in a spiral that seems to become a contemporary monument to the scraps of the contemporary capitalist society. They are discarded clothes, the waste products of a disposable clothing industry that was emerging in the 1960s and of which we would understand the consequences for our contemporary work only much later. By using the rags, Pistoletto makes a political statement against the consumer society, and the obsession for the new, but also offers these scraps a second life. For centuries, rag pickers collected rags door to door, embodying a symbolic figure of a vanished world that had limited resources and capitalized on the reuse of waste materials. In 1960s Italy, rag pickers were still in operation, but their job was doomed to disappear. In Business of the Rags, Pistoletto reclaims the repurposed nature of the rags, which were collected for centuries to produce paper and more recently to create recycled textile fibers. Pistoletto's rags were originally worn as clothes, and once discarded, they have been used to polish his mirror paintings before ending next to the Venus. They are inherently tied to their historical legacy of reuse and represent an early and profoundly material exploration of the concept of recycling. In addition, they also represent, as the artist claims, I quote, the society that surrounds us, that we need to embrace in all its differences. The rags bring the Venus to life. They have a history that I think can be felt. They are a crowd, a society. As artists, we say we want to distinguish ourselves, but what we also need to do is to embrace society, simply become a part of a continually regenerating society. We can use the old to create the new, end of quote. In the reinterpretation of classical sculpture, Arte Povera artists recognize the importance of the legacy of Giorgio di Chirico, the surrealist Italian painter and founder of metaphysical art. Within the Italian tradition and 20th century art more generally, De Chirico paved the way for a new reading of classical sculpture, often inserted in urban context in which the evocative power of statues and fragments was amplified. In these sunny and silent urban landscapes, famous Roman sculptures are apparitions of the past, a sleeping Ariadne in the center of a deserted square, a colossal head of the Apollo Belvedere, which leans against the external facade of a house together with an equally colossal globe, an ancient female bust placed next to a bunch of bananas. In these strident juxtapositions created by the encounter of different words and eras, the sculptures of the past become metaphors of incommunicability. With their presence, they make the enigmatic character of the paintings even more impenetrable. Pistoletto and other Arte Povera artists saw in De Chirico's paintings an inspiring example of a reinterpretation of classical statuary declined in contemporary settings. However, in the artistic context of the 1960s, characterized by the rejection of traditional figurative painting, they resorted to sculptural copies, giving a three-dimensional form to the ancient remains. In Venus of the Rags, the classical sculpture engages in a dialogue with mundane and ordinary objects, the rags, as does De Chirico's ancient bust with the bunch of bananas. High and low are explored in both works in an inventive reading of the artistic tradition. The metaphysical artist was also an important reference for the elaboration of a new kind of temporality in art history, a plural and complex temporality that did not follow a linear development, an approach that Arte Povera artists similarly employed in the use of sculptures from different periods, which were in turn re-elaboration of preceding sources. As demonstrated in the case of the Venus of the Rags, ancient sculpture was also read through the later revivals of classicism, such as the neoclassical one, complicating an art historical narrative that appeared to be entangled and multi-layered. Pistoletto presented replicas of sculptures from the past in several works, also in combination with the reflective surfaces of his famous mirror paintings that surround us today in the gallery. made of polished stainless steel and life-size photographic reproductions. By placing a sculpture in front of the mirror, the artist explores the three-dimensionality of sculpture and its relationship with the observer, the interaction of different levels of representation, and the nature of the image. For a gift of Mercury to the Mirror, Pistoletto borrows once again a sculpture originally made by neoclassical artist Thorvaldsen, depicting Hebe, the goddess of youth and the cupbearer for the gods and goddesses of the Olympus, but it changes the recipient of her offer, which seems to become the mirror, and also the content of her bowl, which is a fragment of a mirror. In the work, the artist investigates different temporal dimensions, the stratification of the past in the sculpture, a present moment in which the visitor activates the work with their presence, and a future dimension given by the interaction of the first two, a coexistence of different temporalities defined by the artist as phenomenological. Standing in the exhibition space, the sculpture invites the viewer to engage with a multiplicity of images reflected and interacting with each other. The viewer engages not only with their own reflected image, but also with the one of the sculpture, which becomes part of the experience reality and of the surrounding environment, which acts as a background. In this interactive experience of the work, the past is brought back to life. Pistoletto worked with a figurative approach to art since his early career, a choice that he explained in the following terms, I quote, "Since I was a child, I have loved antique sculpture. They're not just old artifacts. They are a form of mirroring of the human presence. They are three-dimensional portraiture. Even more than painting, they represent us. They stand for us in space. The statue points into the mirror, leading us beyond the wall of the museum, beyond the white cube. It stands in a pivotal space between our space and the space of the mirror, between the space of the present and the space of the past. If I were to try and describe space, it would be an arrow moving in all directions. It is a portrait of time and space, as much as it is an individual," end of quote. Working in the field of figuration was a countercurrent choice in 1960s Italy, since the faithful representation of reality was seen as linked to an outdated traditional art. For Pistoletto, this choice was, however, consistent with the history of Italian art that had always been figurative. He recalls a veritable epiphany, his first encounter with a work in particular, The Flagellation of Christ by Piero della Francesca, that he saw at the age of 18 on a visit to the Ducal Palace in Urbino with his father, also an artist. The frozen gesture of the man with the whip revealed to a young Pistoletto the potential of movement implied in the suspended action, a concept that would be further developed in the images depicted in his mirror paintings. In addition, the use of the Renaissance perspective had a crucial role in providing a foundation for Pistoletto's manipulation of frontal perspective in his mirror paintings, where he doubled the perspective box in the reflection of the space behind the viewer. In the reinterpretation of classical sculpture in Arte Povera, a mirroring device was also employed by artist Giulio Paolini, who presented in a series of works entitled Mimesis, two identical sculptures facing one another so that their gazes can meet. In this version that is currently on display here in Magazzino in Gallery 7, if you want to go and look at it, the artist employs a plaster cast of the renowned ancient sculpture Hermes and the infant Dionysus, attributed to Praxiteles and found in the 19th century in the archaeological site of Olympia in Greece. As it appears from a visual confrontation of the works, Paolini's cast does not reproduce the entire figure, but only the bust of the Greek god. As in the works realized by Pistoletto, the use of casts allows the artist to engage with a figurative sculpture without having to use the traditional tools of the sculpture that required a physical and direct engagement from the part of the artist with the material. An insightful remark by Arte Povera artist Giuseppe Benone, who employed the casting process in relation to his own body, but not to classical sculpture, can explain the artistic context of this practice. I quote, "Casting is an important part of my work because it's an impression of a body that isn't a representation of a body." In other words, at this moment, the late 60s, when it was essentially forbidden in art to do representation, casting gave the opportunity to reintroduce the figure, to introduce the body, in an objective fashion and not to interpret it. While Pistoletto had explored the casting technique through different materials, Paolini's choice to employ plaster replicas revealed a specific willingness to place his work in dialogue with a specific artistic tradition, that of the sculptural reproduction in the history of art. Since antiquity, casting has been a commonly used method to create copies of statues, and since the Renaissance, these copies have been at the core of artistic education. In 1960s Italy, collections of plaster casts were still on display in fine art academies. In this same period, however, plaster casts started to be considered as symbols of an outdated artistic training and treated with neglect or destroyed. Paolini recovers these copies and through them explores the inner mechanisms of art. The sculpture is doubled and placed on high pedestals, which increase its dimensions and change the point of view of the observer, who is invited to experience the work in silent contemplation. The title is particularly revealing, since the Greek word mimesi or mimesis translates as imitation or representation and refers to the theoretical principle of artistic creation, according to which art can only imitate nature and the surrounding world. In this case, Paolini declares the failure of an art that is restricted to the imitation of reality and proposes as the only possibility another kind of imitation, the imitation of art itself. The two sculptors are engaged in a dialogue that does not include the observer nor the artist. They embody the mysterious and indecipherable nature of art that can be only partially grasped but never fully understood by the viewer. The work also engages with the notions of copy and authorship in relation to the plaster cast. In the casting process, replicas bear traces of the original at different degrees. The highest point of similarity and physical closeness is represented by the original cast, a cast made from a mold taken directly from the original sculpture. From this initial reproduction, other copies are produced. As the reproduction process expands in scales and creates copies based on copies, the reproductions take on new, imperceptible features while progressively losing the perfect resemblance to the original. Paolini's mimesis challenges the dichotomy between the original and the copy, leaving the viewer to wonder who should be considered the author of the work, if Paolini, Praxiteles, or the person who made the cast. The artist seems to suggest that the quest is bound to remain unsolved, since the identification of a single author is not possible. Just as the temporalities embedded in these works are plural and multiple, so too is authorship. Mimesis is the result of the convergence and contribution of different authors, the last of whom is Paolini. Casting is a method of reproduction through contact, concerned with duplicating the same form without replicating the material and density of the original. Casts are hollow. They are impressions of the originals, empty simulacra, duplicated images. As George D.D. Huberman argues, they engage with a process that is based not only on a relationship of contact, but on the loss of this same contact, making the cast an imprint. Paolini describes the method of reproduction as one related to forgery, since a plaster replica simulates an absent original. Photography is also a method of duplication that fascinates the artist and that he employed also in relation to classical sculpture. In Olympia, the art historical source is, as in Mimesis, the ancient sculpture by Praxiteles depicting Hermes. The visual representation of the work is divided vertically into two sections. One on the canvas on the left, Paolini draws the outline of the sculpture, while on that placed on the right, he presents a photographic reproduction of the verso of the sculpture on the verso of the canvas. Photography, as well as casting, is for the artist a medium through which he can investigate the inner nature of art, while establishing a dialogue with the discipline of art history and creating internal cross-references within his own work. Photographs of sculptures are representations of representations and reveal the self-referential nature of the history of art, which Paolini aims to unveil. As Roland Barthes points out, photography has two main characteristics. It allows the image to be revealed, as expressed by the action of light, and is tautological for its very nature, as it always carries its referent with itself. Photography and the casting process are both characterized by indexical properties. They are traces, imprints of the objects depicted. Rosalind Krauss has examined the indexical relationship that photography establishes with the object it represents, explaining that a photograph is the result of a physical imprint transferred by light reflection on a sensitive surface. Just as casts, photographs are reproductions of an absent original. They are at the core of the history of art. Plaster casts have disseminated the knowledge of Western sculpture through the centuries and have served as educational tools for generations of artists, while photographs still are the main medium through which we first encounter the artworks in the study of art history. Even in this moment, we are looking at a photograph, or better, at a photograph of a photograph. By employing both methods of reproduction, Paolini delves into the essence of the history of art, unveiling its creative potential for contemporary practices. Within the Arte Povera group, Greek-born artist Yannis Kounallis also employed plastic casts of ancient sculptures, often in combination with performance. In March 1973, he presented Untitled at Galleria La Salita in Rome. The artist sat motionless, wearing a plaster mask of the god Apollo, behind a table where sections of body parts, also made of plaster, were put on display, together with a black stuffed raven, while the flautist played an excerpt from Mozart. The piece took place regularly, 3 days a week, lasting from 2 to 3 hours each day for the duration of the exhibition. The work's complex layers of meaning can be disentangled by analyzing the central and controversial role of the bodies involved. Following an imaginary itinerary of a progressive loss of life, from the flautist playing, the only active human presence, we are directed to the artist's central position, an immobilized but still living body, and again to a dead animal with a lifelike appearance, the raven, culminating in the scattered reproductions of body parts, which lie white, cold and lifeless on the table. The performance is imbued with an intense dramatic atmosphere, which is rendered by the artist through a skillful orchestration of contrasting elements. The central presence is undoubtedly Cunellis himself, with his face hidden by the mask of the god Apollo. The artist remains silent and immobile, an almost petrified presence. By wearing a mask, Cunellis conceals his own identity, not only as a person, but also as an artist, adopting a different persona. In this process, his real face becomes invisible in order to give the mask physical integrity. The mask, which participates in the long tradition of theater and cult ceremonies, immobilizes the changeable facial expressions by transforming them into a single, immutable expression. By renouncing his own face, the artist embodies someone else who has taken possession of the wearer's body. However, in this case, the new identity is not human, but divine. Cunellis holds in his hands the mask of Apollo, thus turning himself into the Greek god. Or at least, this is how he intended the sculpture to be interpreted, given that, despite being commonly referred to as Apollo, the mask reproduces the facial features of the Capitoline Antinous, a Roman marble sculpture on display at the Musei Capitolini in Rome. His choice of Apollo is particularly significant as the god of prophecy, as Apollo was the god of prophecies, the muses, and the arts. On this occasion, however, the possibility of any prophetic message is denied. By depicting Apollo with his lips sealed and his features paralyzed in a cold plaster mask, Cunellis declares the impossibility of any divine and redeeming message. Although the different sections are clearly plaster cast reproduction of a classical statue, they resemble something very human. This could be due to the fact that as the head of the classical sculpture in pieces is missing, we are not able to determine the art historical source. In their anonymity, the sculptured pieces on the table become a fragmentary representation of the archetype of the human body. The use of plaster has several implications also in relation to the mask, since it recalls also the long tradition of death masks, where a mold of the face of a deceased person, eye closed, was taken on their deathbed. As such, we could look at Apollo as a dead god, an empty simulacrum which declares his own absence. The funereal atmosphere is reinforced by the presence of the raven, a winged animal traditionally associated with death and with the god himself. Although the work is considered a performance, its unusual static nature has brought art critic Rosalie Goldberg to define it as a frozen performance. The only living element and audible sound in the scene is in fact that of the music. The flautist plays an excerpt from Mozart, a musical fragment that is about 30 seconds long and is repeated without interruption. Cunellis takes on the identity of Apollo, the god of prophecy, but seals his lips and eyes. We are spectators of a theophany, a sudden appearance of a god among mortals, but the god has no message to deliver to the humankind. Rather, it seems to have come to earth to witness the tragic state of the human condition, with detachment and indifference. The body parts on the table, white, cold, and sectioned, represent the contemporary tragedy of the humankind. They are fragments. The Latin and Greek terms for fragment all emphasize the violence that produced the fragment, and Cunellis himself has pointed out that fragments are connected to suffering. The artist's childhood and early teenage years had been marked by the war, first the Second World War and then the Greek Civil War. When he left his native town of Piraeus, the port of Athens, to travel to Rome in 1956, he chose to break any bond with his homeland. He didn't write to his mother for 4 years and decided not to speak Greek anymore, a decision that he recalls as a psychic trauma. Laid out on the table is the reminder of a fragmented European world with its culture and its humankind. The only presence who could provide some salvation is Apollo, but the god is blind and silent to the request of the humankind. Could the music do what the god refuses to? It could, but it doesn't. The music here is not employed for its redeeming power. The flautist continuously plays the same passage from Mozart, the same 30 seconds of notes, the same fragment. As a consequence, the scene offers the contemplation of the tragedy of the human condition, but without any hope of salvation. In its meticulous construction as a living picture, with all different elements carefully staged as in a theater setting, the scene is presented to be contemplated, but because of its circularity, it offers no finale and ends in an impasse. Cunali's own words clearly express the unsolved nature of this tragic condition. I quote, "In the fragments, both emotional and formal, I seek the missing history. I dramatically seek the unity, even if it is difficult to grasp, even if it is utopic, and even if it is impossible and therefore dramatic." End of quote. The works that I have analyzed in this lecture reveal how the reinterpretation of classical sculpture in Arte Povera was characterized by a highly experimental approach that combined an inventive use of sculptural replicas and performance. In a period characterized by the dematerialization of the art object, Pistoletto, Paolini, and Cunalis found in the use of traditional methods of sculptural reproduction a way to reclaim the materiality of sculpture and the legacy of the European tradition in a context increasingly dominated by American art. Through the casting process, they explored crucial notions for art historical discourse, challenging the division between original and copy, and exploring the indexical properties of a method of replication through contact. By recovering the figurative tradition of art, they demonstrated that artistic tradition was still relevant and an important source of inspiration, thus paving the way for the creative reinterpretation of the past in contemporary art. Thank you. If anyone has any question, I think this is the time for the Q&A.
Roberta, thank you so much. That was just fantastic and fascinating. And I was always intrigued by the fact that these Italian artists drew upon their artistic traditions, and as avant-garde as they were, they reinterpreted it in the ways that you explained, and I think that was just very creative. Have you seen in an international country, other countries, other artists, other disciplines, the use of this historical, drawing on this historical matter in contemporary work?
Thank you for the question. That's very interesting. I think the only precedent in this period is a work by Jasper Johns, which was exhibited in, I think it was in Milan. It's a target piece. It's one of his target works. And in the upper part, there are some kind of wooden boxes where he placed some casts, but they're colored, so they have different colors, so it's also a different approach of a human face. So it is similar in a way in the use of cast as a method of reproduction as contact, but it's not referring to classical sculpture, and the whiteness that we have in the sculptures is also very relevant in terms of reclaiming this artistic tradition. Then I would jump directly to more postmodernist practices. So we can think of Jeff Koons, who made this series of plastic casts with the bow, but that is a very recent theory, and these artists were working with this kind of plastic cast in late 60s and early 70s. And they were, I think, the first to employ classical sculpture in these terms, which was seen as outdated. We know that these plastic cast galleries in academies during the 1968, students were occupying universities. They were writing graffitis on these reproductions. They were destroying them, or sometimes because they wanted to experiment with new practices which needed like more space in the rooms of the academy. They just wanted them to put it somewhere else, like in storage. So it's very interesting that they recovered this reproduction in this way, which I do believe it's highly experimental, absolutely. It's just another way of reclaiming this past.
I read that Margarita Stein of Christian Stein Gallery, when she had a gallery in New York with Barbara Gladstone in the 80s, and they brought this work here, and she said how she had to teach mythology to a lot of the Americans.
That is very interesting.
Because in Europe and in Italy, it was taught in the schools, they were familiar, but in the United States, it was it was not part of the curriculum.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, because we know that when Cunelis presented at Sonneman Gallery, so it was a performance that he had presented at Lattico before, and then he presented that at Sonneman Gallery. He was sitting on a horse, like a live, real horse, wearing this plastic mask of Apollo. So there was no movement involved also in this performance. And we know that the reception was really, really bad. Our critics didn't see the point of the sculpture. It was not a performance. So we know that it is true that probably to an external audience and to an American audience, these references that were not so easily readable as it was from a European visitor or audience. That's a very interesting difference.
And I just wanted to add another thing about this, because we do actually do that a lot at Magazzino when we give tours, especially for Paolini. We do need to explain the mythology around it. Also Luciano Fabro all around, even though there's not any kind of iconographical kind of reference there, but definitely that tie with the classic.
It's true, but I think it's very interesting that these kind of references introduced in the work of art a narrative dimension, because even if you just put a title to an abstract sculpture, let's say, there is an old narrative unfolding that goes back and that surrounds the work that you're looking at. So I think it's very important to explain these kind of references, because it adds like layers of complexity to the work. So yeah.
I was just wondering about the Venus of the Rags. Something that seemed obvious to me, but you didn't mention it, and I was wondering what you thought. Do you feel that there is a statement being made about the expendability of these clothes in general by the fact that they're juxtaposed with this perfect nude with no clothes? I mean, there's something about clothes I feel in there too that I'd love your comments.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think Pistoletto employs these rags in their kind of second life, like in their afterlife. So it is, yes, there is definitely a reference to clothes, and it's interesting to see that it was really anticipating the times and also certain ecological awareness in terms of recycling, not only in terms well, we can see like some of his works with paper, with rags, and that is very interesting, because I think he was already thinking about this kind of recycling process. He had already kind of recycled the clothes because he was using them to polish these mirror paintings, so to clean them. So they were in his studio, basically, and they were probably like arranged in a similar kind of disordered manner. We don't know, but yes, absolutely, there are there is also a reference to this first life of the rags.
I hope I'm not repeating something that's already been covered, and this goes well beyond Arte Povera, but why don't we see any paint on the plaster or on the marble? I mean, I understand from my own vision I wouldn't want to, but it just seems like with all of the color that's in the painting and all the color that is so prevalent in life and in art, that have sculptures been painted, whether plaster or marble?
You mean historically, if they were painted, or why did these Arte Povera artists chose not to paint them?
I mean, it just seems that even if it were an aberration, that there would have been some paint applied to some sculpture at some point in time.
Thank you for the question. I think in the examples that I have presented, the fact of working with white plaster cast was due to the connections to art historical traditions, because we now know that classical sculpture was really hyper-realistically colored. There was also a recent exhibition of the Met. But at the time, when they found the sculptures in the following centuries buried underneath, the color had faded away. So we thought that ancient sculptures were white. And then, of course, I think a very important factor is the interpretation of neoclassicism. So these artists come at the end of all these reinterpretations, and as I've shown, like, neoclassicism was a particularly important one. And for neoclassicism, these sculptures had to be pure white. There was no color involved. So in a way, by using these sculptures in white without painting them, they want to be they want to continue, I believe, this kind of tradition. But there was an artist who painted this cast, and it was Cunellis. Actually, in a re-elaboration of this initial performance in the 70s. So there are some examples, but not in these years that I have talked about. Slightly later, he paints these casts in yellow, and he paints other in purple. So with this kind of nervous brush stroke, so not like very redefined paint, like way of painting. But yes, there are some artists, but then I think it was kind of another phase of research for these artists. That one.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I wanted to ask about this last piece, the flutist on the far left. It's the only live element in the way, as you described. He's playing these 30-second repetitions of the Mozart fragment. And the thought crossed my mind is Cunellis invoking the theme of time and the futility and repetition of time, because everything else is fragmented or still or dead or hidden. And this is very live, but it's over and over. It's the same song, if you know what I'm saying. Does that?
Yeah, thank you. I think the music in this work adds another dimension, and it's a kind of, in this kind of obsessive repetition, it says something similar to the message which is delivered by the cast, that, it's a tragic condition, there's no salvation in the post-war human condition. Let's not forget that these artists lived in first person the atrocities of the Second World War. They were like growing up while that was happening, and Cunellis had some really tragic memories of this period. The music, the way in which I see the use of music in this work is that it's an attempt at giving hope and freedom and a kind of lightness to the work as well. But the fact that it's always repeating itself, this obsessive and very short fragment, it means that even if there is this attempt unfortunately, it's there is no happy hand. Like I said, there's no finale because it's a circular repetition, and it's a very interesting reference to temporality, also for this entangled and complex temporality that adds like new meanings to the work.
This artist did a lot of performance. Pistoletto and Cunelis did a lot of performance pieces. So
Cunelis in particular used music a lot, but also in the form of fragments. So I think that there was something, it is a recurring theme in Cunelis' practice.
Hi, thank you for the rich and informative lecture. I have a question, and maybe it's a foolish question, I'm not really sure. I'm a teacher, I'm good. I'm loud.
It's for recording purposes.
Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll comply. So I have studied at the graduate level a series of courses on Italian neorealism film, and my complete knowledge of Arte Povera is from here. So I thank the museum for that. But what my question is, and again, if it's a bad question, you don't have to take the time for it, but could you speak if there is a connection between Arte Povera and the neorealism movement of film? I don't know. I mean, I'm seeing connections, but maybe there isn't.
Well, thank you. No, I think there are connections because Cunelis was living in Rome at the time, and there were like these neorealist filmmakers were part of the same artistic and cultural circles. And I think that in both cases, both for these artists and for neorealist films, there was a kind of making art was a kind of way to come to terms with this recent past, which was highly problematic, and I think like Italy still in the way of processing in a way because it's highly charged of emotions, and also it was a country in debris. I mean, they even physical. I mean, materially, the bombings destroyed the big parts of different cities in Italy, but also there was a cultural identity that was also fragmented and in pieces. So I think making art in this period was a way to move forward, and also by looking at the past, but by also trying to re-elaborate the same past in artistic terms.
I think in terms of similarity to Arte Povera, we could also elaborate a bit about the Gutai movement in Japan. Both Italy and Japan had lost a tremendous war where the cultural and loss for both Italy and Japan was enormous. So the new generations felt that it was time to renew, time to start. And they didn't start with something that was completely new. They start by looking at their past, because their past, even if the near past was for them very painful, the further past was very important for who they were. And there is not an accident when you see that the work done by the Gutai movement and the work done by the Arte Povera are very similar. Both were born into industrial towns that they were, in a way, the rebirth of both countries. Fiat in Torino and Toyota in Japan were part of this trying to have a new modern life. So the moment, the historical moment that both lived was very similar. And what do you take on this?
I think you are absolutely right, and this is also the reason why Arte Povera is often connected to the Gutai movement, and also in this exploration of materiality. We can also think of Burri as a precedent to Arte Povera, of course, in terms of working with these woods, also like materially, where it was using painting. These artists are, are from a different generation, so they're using other artistic means. And it strikes me, in particular, if we think of Japan and Italy, so of the art that was emerging in these countries at the moment, and then if we think of American art, it is a completely different artistic context. The fact that these nations have gone through a historical trauma brought these artists towards a certain direction, while the US was involved in the war, as we know, helping other nations, but didn't have war at home, if we can say, was already projective in a much more optimistic future that we know it was not so bright as we now know, but it was the emergence of the capitalist society, was the pop art. So there was a whole different artistic vibrant scene that was not I think the emotions involved in this kind of art are very different. So it's very interesting, the comparison that you make, and it is absolutely the case. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I think.
One more?
I wanted to thank you, Roberta,
Thank
for
you.
this
It's been a pleasure.
interesting
Thank
lectures and for all the research. One thing I wanted to say is that this is really the topic. This is really the topic that Roberta pitched us when you actually applied to the fellowship, and I'm glad we were able to share and see so many works from the collection. And this is also part of the result of your entire experience here at Magazzino.
It's a beautiful project. I'm really happy I had the way to deliver it to an audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.